So hello again, and welcome to today's SCOPE webinar, the final talk in the current series that's featuring Yukon University's research chairs and leaders. We're hosting today's talk with respect and gratitude on the traditional territory of the Kwamandun First Nation and the Tonquetchin Council. My name's Sabrina Kinsella, and I'm the Acting Senior Science Advisor for the Yukon Government. Today, we're going to hear from Dave Mossop, biology instructor and professor emeritus at Yukon University, and someone who likely needs no introduction for many in Yukon science and conservation community. Dave's decades of work in biology and biodiversity practice and study with Yukon Government and Yukon University have garnered him several awards, including the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, or COSEWIC, Long Service Award, Yukon's Biodiversity Achievement Award, and Couture Stewardship Award, and a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Canadian Museum of Nature. We'll hear from Dave about his ongoing work in biodiversity research with Yukon University. I know that Dave would rather be out in the field than on a screen, so I really appreciate him being open to presenting to us in this format. And I'll hand the mic over now. Welcome, Dave. Sorry, I've muted you temporarily. Can you unmute yourself?
Dave, you got to unmute yourself.
I'm getting strange messages on my screen. Boy, I hate this. But anyway, I'm a bit of a Luddite, so I'll go ahead. This project or this research is going to be a little different than some of the research that people are exposed to just because of the long time that it's been around. This is the 25th year that the project has been at Yukon University, and for about 20 years before that, it was conducted off the side of a desk in the Yukon government. The project is mostly about maintaining long data sets, tracking population dynamics of some key species, indicator species that help us track changes in Yukon ecosystems. So that's the purpose. Birds have been for a whole bunch of reasons, the sentinel species that we've chosen to track in this work. And the project has also developed some rather large groups of collaborators across the world, in particular in the circumpolar world. So it's a project that has deep roots and has attracted a lot of collaborators that have helped it develop over the years. The idea is to it's not working. Must be Kinzella's.
What's going on?
It's not. I can't track through my slides.
Sorry. On work, do that in the PowerPoint, not the Zoom screen.
It's not. Oh, I hate this thing.
Sorry, Dave.
So I'm having a hard time showing my slides here. Just a second.
Are you clicking in the PowerPoint or are you clicking in the Zoom?
I'm trying everything I can.
Okay.
It's not working.
If you can send me the PowerPoint, I could share it and advance your screens for you. Sorry that I didn't prepare that in advance. But I know I have seen them in advance, so I think it's possible.
Oh, this is terrible. I'm sorry.
Oh, don't be sorry. We did We did some testing, but happened at the time of the event.
Funny, it doesn't. Do you want me to stop sharing my screen and then?
Maybe try that. Try stop share and then reshare.
So that looks good. And now you're in presenter mode.
Okay, it looks like I've got it now.
Now it's
There we go.
advancing.
Yeah.
So we're, as I indicated, we have selected a number of species based on their use as indicator or sentinel species, and about 40 years of data are involved. So there's no way. The project is also divided up into a whole series of little segments. So there's no way that we're going to be able to talk at length at any of them. But so I've decided I'd just give you a whole series of slides, giving you a feeling for the projects that are going on. Indicator species can be flagship species, which is and just a word that talks about a bird that or an animal that is well known and is attractive to people and can attract attention towards conservation efforts. The idea of producing dominant species in the community and using them as indicators is really what we're after. So a keystone species is a species that if we remove the species from the system, we can depend on it having a rather large effect on the whole ecosystem. So we'll be talking a little bit about that. There's a couple of critical habitats that the project has focused on. Wetlands is one of them. Wetlands are responsible for so much of the diversity of the life in the Yukon Territory. And water birds are the things that we use to track as basically as instruments out on the land to tell us how this system is functioning. The other major system that we've been looking at is tundra. Tundra is one of the dominant ecoregions in Canada, next to the boreal forest. It's one of the largest ecoregions. And we have been tracking the tundra community through willow ptarmigan. Willow ptarmigan is grouse that lives on the tundra, is a keystone species, and the gyrfalcon at the top of the food chain is the other indicator. Gyrfalcon at the top of the food chain requires the whole system to be working properly. Tundra systems are dominated, as people know, by fears of climate disruption because they're very susceptible to those kinds of changes. The project is designed around creating smaller research projects that students can pick up and use, and has resulted in a number of published and unpublished and student papers that they've written for credit. So that's one of the major objectives of this project, is to provide a foundation for students to pick up pieces of research, and so that they can do meaningful conservation and population research as student credit. So the keystone species out on the tundra. The reason this is a keystone species, this is the willow ptarmigan. Willow ptarmigan are one of the most important converters of the plant community to the animal community. So, and a whole series of creatures are totally dependent on the use of ptarmigan as prey. They're called willow ptarmigan because basically they live in willow and they eat willow. In the wintertime, they are exclusively a herbivore in the wintertime. At the top of the food chain are a couple of major birds of prey. The gerfalcon, or the golden eagle, is on the left, migratory bird, but by far the most important mover and shaker, if you like, in the tundra system is the gerfalcon. The gerfalcon's on the right. This is this largest of the true falcons, highly charismatic bird, and a specialist for hunting ptarmigan. It is completely dependent on ptarmigan at the early part of its breeding season, and so it makes a wonderful creature to track. Now, the tundra part of this project uses 3 broadly spaced study areas that we have data on all 3 of them. The North Slope is obviously the one that's most expensive and has the it's very difficult to get new data on. The central Yukon and the southern Yukon populations are the ones that we know best. So ptarmigan monitoring. Ptarmigan monitoring started out in the early 70s with some pretty sophisticated population research, territorial behavior, winter survival strategies, and breeding strategies. And using that information, we're able to devise some protocols for doing annual monitoring. So that's what we do every late winter about this time. We're out on the tundra, tracking an area that's standardized. We use the same area every year. The males are, as in the picture at the top, is a male in its breeding conditions. So they're really obvious. The work that we did earlier used marked birds so that with color bands on the right-hand side, you can see some color bands so that we knew that we were dealing with the same birds. That research went on for about 2 or 3 years. We feel really comfortable that we can go out into the tundra now and very quickly get an excellent handle on exactly how many ptarmigan there are on the tundra. So that work has been going on and continues to this day. Gerfalcons are monitored primarily by air survey. They nest on cliffs. So some of the early work trying to get together information on population ecology, etc., involves some pretty heroic kinds of field work. But we have at least 30 years of annual monitoring of gerfalcons in all of our study areas. Now, what did we find? This slide is one created by the first master student that showed up on the project. This is built by Norm Baricello, who lives here. This finding was a collaboration between the work I was doing with ptarmigan and the gerfalcon work that he was doing, and he was able to discover this very, very straight relationship between the productivity of gerfalcons and the number of ptarmigan around the land. It's almost as if gerfalcons have this sophisticated method of monitoring numbers of ptarmigan before they breed. Now, this work has developed into a whole series of published papers and in fact a book recently on the gerfalcons in the Yukon, and has built into an understanding of the relationship between these two things as community members out on the tundra. It's been interesting to try to figure out exactly how the gerfalcons have been doing this monitoring of ptarmigan numbers, and that's a large part of the contribution that Norm Baricello has made. Interestingly, that work is continuing, and we continue to monitor the ptarmigan and the gerfalcon. And in the last 20 years, we've been seeing some disruption, and this is causing great concern. The ptarmigan on the tundra are a classic 10-year cycle. Many of the creatures in the boreal forest cycle in a 10-year cycle, so numbers go up every 10 years and crash. And it's one of the most important and obvious ecological features of the boreal system. And it looks like in the case of the ptarmigan, it has winked out. around the turn of the century, we started to see a disruption in that cycle. And we don't know why. This is one of the great mysteries of this research, and think obviously what we're trying to figure out now. The idea is that perhaps it will reestablish itself, but it hasn't done so. And there is some evidence that the ptarmigan populations, in particular in the central Yukon, are slowly declining, presumably as a result of this. Now, we look at the top of the food chain at the gerfalcons, and there's likewise looks like a small effect. Now, what they're doing is that gerfalcon production of youngsters seems to be going down, and the breeding population looks like, at least by one measure, to be declining. Why this is happening is the great mystery. What is happening in the tundra system? It's warmer. We get these nice warm early springs, and yet it just doesn't make sense. So this is exactly what we're looking at now. One of the things that we are aware that's happening on the tundra that might be affected is the response of vegetation to the elephant in the room, which of course is this climate catastrophe that we're in now. In 1975, this is a cabin in the middle of the Oak Grove Flats, about 100 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle that we have done a lot of work out of. In 1975, it was basically shrub tundra. And you can see 20 years later, it's now basically a forest. This is actually jaw-dropping to see when you work out of an area and you go back and see that it's changed violently. So basically what this is saying is that perhaps we're losing tundra in places in the Yukon. And of course, the effect of this is going to be catastrophic to creatures that need tundra. Wetlands are a slightly different kind of operation. Wetlands in Yukon are very interesting because this is the Oak Grove Flats. This place gets 200 millimeters of precipitation in a year. So it's basically a desert. And yet look at its water. That water is all held in place by ice. It's held up and held in its borders by ice. It's basically a permafrost feature, and is home to thousands and thousands of water birds every year. Wetlands, in the case of wetlands, we're using water birds. So students go out every year and track the number of birds that are using a standard set of ponds every year. We've done a fair amount of marking birds, catching and banding birds to find out basically how they're using the world. And we're also very keen on measuring water level changes over time. Wetlands are suffering in a number of places. This is a camp that's been used for generations by people, by a family in Oak Grove, and it doesn't even exist anymore. As you can see now, what is happening is, of course, the permafrost that holds this pond in place is melting, and the whole system, the whole land is actually sinking. It's quite interesting to try to figure out what's happening. But there's no question that our wetlands are in a bit of a delicate situation. Now, water birds are interesting creatures to use as indicators because of the huge scientific literature that talks to us about the ecology, the way that these things use habitat, their timing, and everything. It's a long, long history. So we feel really confident when we look at wetlands through the eyes of things like ducks. So a lot of this work is canoe work. We go out on the land, and in the top picture you can see a duck with it's a female widgeon, it turns out, with a brood of 3 behind her. So looking at that duck, we can first of all identify it, but then also those youngsters it's interesting that they can be aged based on protocols that have been put in place many, many years ago. we can age them to within a very few days. And what that allows us to do then is backtrack their to their hatch date, and so we can compare hatching dates across the which we've done, in a number of cases. So this is what's happening, and this is an interesting result. One of the results that from our waterfowl work. Lower down on these graphs is earlier in the year. So the water birds are hatching at least 2 weeks earlier than they did originally. Songbirds likewise are hatching earlier, but it's not as clear. And shorebirds, so these are sandpipers and things, look like they're hatching later. So it's confusing. But the point is that it's changing. And this is not necessarily good. The use of time as a strategy in the North has been documented over and over again as being extremely important. Things are timed, basically with the environment. To see changes like this, although it's really difficult to figure out, so what if the birds are hatching earlier? It intuitively we feel this is not great, and in fact we are losing some of these birds. There's some evidence that waterbird species are disappearing, whether declining, whether it's because of this or not, we don't know. We do know that there's disruption happening in the thing. Songbirds, small birds, students get the opportunity to be part of one of the largest citizen science research efforts in North America with these birds. So we go out dawn across parts of this. We do it on the tundra and record the territorial calls of birds. Small birds might occupy the land very, very differently. The one on the left is a Canada jay. It's a non-migratory bird, and of course, swallows on the right are highly migratory. So they use the world very, very differently, and it's difficult in a place like the Yukon to get together and research projects that make sense. One group of birds that we have been able to put together some really nice research projects for students in particular are birds that nest in holes. So these are birds that need woodpecker nests in order to nest. And we have a whole series of nest boxes at Yukon Wildlife. There are 40 nest boxes, and we're able to monitor these two species, the mountain bluebird on the right and the tree swallow on the left. Use those nest boxes primarily. And we've been able to develop a series of Yukon student projects looking at nest parasites, looking at breeding time numbers. You can just imagine checking these nest boxes every year. And we've been able to develop some really interesting differences between these two birds. Bluebirds, as most people know, are declining across North America. And we were most interested in seeing what happens when they come here. And it turns out that we can demonstrate that these birds, once they get to the Yukon, they're doing just fine. They're able to produce a good brood. They're often able to produce 2 broods a year. They seem to be doing just fine. So clearly their problem is somewhere else. The swallow is a slightly different case. We can really demonstrate that there are some years, and in fact most years, these birds are in some trouble. It's not uncommon for us to find many dead swallows in our boxes. So what's happening is these birds are coming back in the spring. These two birds both use insects. The bluebird is a thrush, and it feeds on the ground and in vegetation, and it has no problem finding insects to eat in the spring, whereas the swallow needs flying insects. And flying insects in the spring, some springs here are really rare because we get these weird springs where we get an early spring and yet people say, well, the spring just never comes. It just never seems to get warm up properly. And in those springs, this species really suffers. We've found up to 6 dead adult swallows in boxes. So they go into the boxes, into their nest boxes, and they try to survive basically during those years. So that's something that's been it's something that's been interesting to track, and we're continuing that work. One of the things that happens when we're tracking species is that we discover species that are in serious trouble. They're at risk of going extinction. Now, this is the first bird that the project addressed in that regard. This is the peregrine falcon, and a master's student who was working on the bird. They nest on cliffs again, so accessing their nests can be tricky at times. So most people know that the problem this thing was having was that it couldn't hatch young. It was suffering from pesticide poisoning. The youngsters were dying in the shell, and the adults weren't able to hatch youngsters, and the population crashed. The Yukon had a unique position in addressing the peregrine problem, in that we had a remnant population. The bird basically went extinct across North America in the 70s. We had a remnant population, and we were able to take the last youngsters that were being produced in the Yukon and put them into a breeding facility, one in Alberta and one here in the Yukon, and breed them in captivity. It had never been done before. And raise these youngsters on good, clean food, so they had no pesticides, in them at all, and then take them back into the wild. And then our job was to try to persuade the remnant adults, and then we only had a very, very few of them by this time, to raise the youngsters. And that turned out to be successful. And it turned out to be one of the most gratifying conservation programs to be involved with. The birds recovered, as is shown here. And by the turn of the century, we figured that the population in the Yukon was about the same or even higher than it was originally. Now, this work is continuing, and it talks to a number of things, population and research and management-wise. Interestingly, again, about 20 years ago, something started to happen, and a couple of things. One of the things that happened is that the Endangered Species Act, which looks at animals in trouble in Canada, is a national act, and that act, around the turn of the century, lost interest in the peregrine because it had presumably had recovered and was delisted. We argued very strongly that shouldn't have happened, because what we were seeing at that time was a decline in the production of young. For some reason, the peregrine population in Yukon, something like 20 to 30% of the adults are actually producing young. The rest are just coming back here doing nothing. If you do a tiny bit of mathematics with that, you realize that can't go on. And so what we were saying is there's a pretty good reason for continuing to monitor this population. What is really needed, of course, is a regional Endangered Species Act or legislation. The National Act allows for that to be, and actually expects regional legislation to be produced. We haven't done anything like that in the Yukon, and it's really a shame, because what this bird is basically being ignored now, because basically there's no legal reason for government people, et cetera, to be spending money on it. And what we're doing is monitoring the decline of the bird. Again, it's actually quite distressing, and that work continues. So here's another little bird that exemplifies a creature that really needs a regional Endangered Species Act legislation. This is the American kestrel. American kestrel is a tiny little falcon. It was by far the most common bird of prey in the Yukon 20 years ago, and is now virtually extinct. Bird watchers are lucky to see one, in fact, and it's just such a shame. It's a beautiful little bird. It's makes its living by hunting. It's one of the falcons that can hunt by hovering. So this bird is hovering over the vegetation, looking at the small birds and small mammals. But they're in the summertime, they are mostly eating big insects. So this creature can catch dragonflies, if you can believe it. Very, very fast flyers, wonderful little creatures. And we've been tracking their numbers for many years. The reason that we can study them is that they nest in holes in trees. They need big woodpecker holes. And so we were able to put up a whole series of big nest boxes. These ones, we've got over 160 of them in the Yukon, all the way up to the last trees before the Arctic Circle, and monitor them every year to see what's in them. It turns out that they produce a lot of young. 5 or 6 young is very common, which is unusual for a bird of prey. And again, one of these birds that we found that once they're here in the Yukon and breeding, they're doing just fine, but the numbers are extremely small. The numbers have been declining. In 2007, the bird extirpated completely. There were none of our nest boxes had any birds in them, whereas in the early days it was running about 50%. The number of kestrels that we're seeing now is 2 or 3 pairs bouncing along right along the bottom line. So the bird is in serious trouble, and that's happening not here only, but right across North America. And we published with our partners across the continent several papers now looking at the decline. The decline across, it's around 50% decline across the continent, and our decline is about 90%. The one on the right is the paper that's being produced now, and the red line, the one on the bottom, is the Yukon data. It looks like the birds that occupy the limits of the range, which is of course the far north, are doing the worst. We don't know why. It's people, all kinds of minds are working on this now to try to figure out what on earth is wrong with the poor little kestrel. We seem to produce lots of youngsters. The youngsters, the few nests that do survive here in the north, they go off and they basically just disappear. So this is another little project that we were involved with. This is a monitoring project of birds moving. This is a site of a wind turbine that the people at Burwash are planning on erecting. The top slide shows a ridge, and along that ridge is where the turbines are going to be. In front of it is a lagoon. That lagoon is really attractive to birds. Birds flying up the lake are attracted by the lagoon. They go up and they go right through that site. There is a tower, a research tower on that that was erected there, 20 guy wires. The birds would fly through that, and so it was a wonderful opportunity to monitor. There is this notion that wind turbines are killing birds constantly. So we were keen on seeing trying to figure out exactly how many that would be. And then, of course, when the turbine is up, we're going to continue that work. It turns out that we are able to monitor something like 200 birds an hour going through that site. And of those 200 birds an hour, a few do hit the tower. Birds hit towers, it's amazing. The birds have eyes that are so much better than ours, and yet they seem to just fly right into things that are in their way. And we estimated probably 6 birds a year, which is, if you know anything about ecological and mortality in nature, is nothing, are going to be hitting that tower. We can predict that, and we were able to actually get them to move the turbines and design the turbines, in fact, slightly differently, and hopefully we'll be able to continue that work. The interesting thing about this, we were doing a companion study looking at the bird effects of a reservoir-driven hydro site, which is, this is the one at Ajax. So the top is one of the Ajax wetlands associated with that lake, tremendously productive, lots and lots of ducks and creatures using it. And of course, the effect of that site has been devastating. When you drain wetlands, you basically destroy the habitat. A turbine, the bird gets killed and it's lying there, everybody sees it. You destroy the habitat, the problem is that nobody sees it. You can kill thousands of birds doing that. So this work has been quite enlightening, and it will continue. This is part of the project as well. The Yukon doesn't have a biodiversity specimen museum. Virtually every place that you could think of does. Why we don't, of course, is a mystery, but there are birds and specimens of all kinds of creatures from the Yukon in museums all over the world, literally, but none here in the Yukon. So what we've been trying to do is collect specimens. These are specimens that people have picked up, basically hitting windows and hitting by cars, and we're saving them and having students and other people skin them and produce these museum specimens. These things have become really valuable in terms of study items, basically teaching tools, but also research structures for monitoring things like, well, how various chemicals are changing in animals, etc. There's a whole bunch of reasons for collecting specimens. We have a pretty good herbarium now, plant specimens, and we have approaching, it's approaching 1,000 specimens of birds, along with about 5,000 or 6,000 measurements of birds. And last but not least, probably one of the most important parts of a project like this is public education. We've spent a lot of time with students developing courses here at the university, but also taking public people out and students from schools out. Very, very powerful teaching tool. If you want to, for teaching empathy for wild creatures, putting a bird in the hands of a student, they'll never forget it. Wild birds and birds in the hand have been used for teaching forever, and we've been desperately trying to get a really nice sample of birds in the hand. So these birds in the hand are usually birds that can't be released because of injury. And once a bird has been in a person's hand and released, going off into the life to make its life living in the land, is extremely powerful. That student will never forget that event. At any rate, this is just simply a summary now of what we've been talking about. The project is based on databases that are maintained through annual monitoring. We do diversity assessment and keystones or indicator species, and give students the opportunity to develop conservation options, population ecology understandings, and currently we have an array of about 16 field and laboratory efforts, including public education, specimen preparation, data analysis, key population monitoring, and problem solving. And students can get involved with the project through field jobs and doing class project, doing course studies, and thesis work. And with that, I thank you for putting up with me.
Thank you so much, Dave. I really appreciate you persevering through the technical challenges, as that was an amazing slide deck and well worth the trouble, at least from my perspective. I'd like to open it up to questions. I mentioned at the start, you're welcome to type your questions into the chat if you want me to read it out, or raise your hand with the button or in your image, and I'll ask you to unmute. Or if people are really quiet, we might be able to have a bit of a free-for-all. We'll see how that goes. Allison has asked whether there are new projects planned, and I see a hand up. Do you have any new projects planned, Dave?
Just keeping the ones that, in particular with this nasty virus of yours around, it's been really difficult to maintain to keep the data, the basic databases maintained. So that's basically what I'm focusing on. I would like to and have visions of doing some more monitoring on the North Slope. So if anybody has deep pockets, a big bag of money under your bed, we could use it. That's a very expensive place to work. But we have, I have data sets from the North Slope from 15 years ago, and it would be really, really valuable to re-establish connections to the North Slope. So that's
that. Shauna, you've got your hand raised.
Hi, yeah, so sorry, clear my throat. I'm Shona. I'm with the Yukon Invasive Species Council, and I'm very new to the world of invasive species and biodiversity, for that matter. And I'm curious to know how you've seen a change transition in sort of the way invasives are in the Yukon in some of these sort of very fragile habitat you've looked at. Have you noticed change? Do you know? Yeah, can you speak to invasive species a little bit?
Are you interested primarily in plants? Is that what you're talking about, or
Anything? Plants are definitely one of the first. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. When you've tracked things for like 50 years, that we've done, this is basically a life's work we're talking about here. So it's, as a research project, it's kind of odd, but anyway, there are some jaw-dropping changes. One of the biggest things that I really worry about is I mentioned it looks like the 10-year cycle is winking out, or has winked out. That's something that we're watching very, very carefully. That is a major, that's been noted in the scientific literature over 100 years, and suddenly, and we were tracking it nicely here for several 30 years, and then suddenly it's gone. That's something that really bothers me. One of the other thing that I think it becomes really clear with tracking some of these birds that we're tracking is the fact that you're interested in invasive species. Some of the naturally occurring species in the Yukon have become what could be called invasive, because through the actions of human beings, some of them are getting a real advantage. And some of these tend to be scavengers. I worry about things like herring gulls. Herring gulls populations are exploding in places. These are really interesting birds because they're very, very smart and really good predators of all kinds of things. The other bird that I'm a little bit worried about and I've watched exploding in numbers is a bald eagle. The bald eagle was quite rare at one point, but Americans stopped shooting them, and all of a sudden there's all kinds of them. And they compete with other creatures. They're a very, very effective predator. And the one bird that we have watched suffering, if you like, in the face of the exploding population of bald eagles is our osprey. Ospreys in places are disappearing, and whether it's totally because of the bald eagle, I don't know, but it sure looks like it.
Thanks very much for that. We've had a couple of comments coming in the chat, just thanking you for your work and your presentation, and a couple of questions as well. From Jan, a thank you, first of all. And Jan is wondering why a Regional Endangered Species Act would be useful. Would you mind talking about that a bit?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear it.
Jan has asked why a Regional Endangered Species Act would be useful.
One of the things that we see when, across a huge country like Canada is that regionally things, aren't, the same everywhere. And that's been clear with things like our little kestrel that we're working on. The population has gone to zero, and you can't even get attention from the rest of Canada because people still see them in other places. It's one of the reasons that we really need. And one of the things that we notice is that government, and of course, government in Canada, government funding is basically the funding that drives all kinds of management, seems to depend on legislation. So if it's legislated that an endangered species needs to be looked at, and the way the peregrine, for instance, was at the end it was given status as something with special It's of special concern. And basically what that says that you should be monitoring the thing. Internationally, once a bird has gone into serious decline and then has recovered, it doesn't lose that, it doesn't lose its status. It remains status as a bird that is in harm's way, and or an animal that is in harm's way. And that is the kind of thing that legislation locally could address. We know that there are many species in the Yukon that are not being served well by the National Act. We go through a process every 5 years of getting experts together, looking at creatures in the Yukon and deciding among themselves whether what its status is. And it turns out that every time we do that, we find more creatures that are not being served well by the National Act. So that's one of the reasons that we really should be thinking about producing something locally.
Thanks very much. Another question from the chat. This is from Megan. She says, I see some of the species you spoke about, including kestrels, around my place fairly regularly. Is there a way that she can contribute to some of your monitoring programs?
I didn't hear the question completely, but basically it's somebody who has kestrels at their house. I'm really interested in that sort of a thing. We collect those data. We collect the data of people seeing them. The study group, or the group, is the birds that use my nest boxes. You can understand that it has to be a standard way of monitoring their numbers. But people are seeing them. There's a few of them around, and I'm really keen on those data. You know, if people have those kinds of observations, I'd love to get them.
Great. So maybe she could email you. Would that be the best way to?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, well.
Okay. I'll put Dave's email in the chat in a moment. A question from Maria. I think this is in reference to the invasive species question. What about magpies?
Magpies. If you had moved to the Yukon in, say, the late '60s, you wouldn't have seen magpies. They're a bird that has arrived here. When I first arrived in the Yukon in 1970, and we saw magpies, it was a relatively rare bird. And of course, now they're quite common. They do really well with human beings. All of those scavengers do. Human beings are very wasteful creatures, and we're high livers, and we produce a lot of food and waste a lot of food. And birds like ravens and magpies and gray jays get along really well with people. So whether they're becoming invasive or not, I really don't have the data. They do prey on small birds, but they are an indigenous species, so it's hard to figure out whether they're actually causing problems, like some of those other birds that I am seeing problems.
This is my question, and it may be a silly one, but something I've heard is that the terns are, or seagulls as we call them often, are pushing the ravens out of Whitehorse in the summer. Is that founded, or is that
I don't think so. But ravens winter in the Whitehorse area and leave to nest in the summertime. So most of the ravens that are here in the summertime are juvenile ravens. The adults are gone. The adults go off to breed. They're not being chased away. They just go. We banded some ravens, young ravens here in Yukon. That was a project that we started with some students that wanted to do something with ravens. Ravens are an incredibly smart bird. So we built a huge trap, and we banded. It worked once. It's interesting. It caught a bunch of ravens, and we banded those ravens, let them go, and no raven ever went near that trap again. Ravens are communicators, and it's amazing. So we lost our opportunity, but one of the ravens that we banded ended up breeding in Tok in Alaska. So that talks to us a little bit about how far they're coming to winter at our dump here.
All right. Well, thank you for clearing up my misconception there. certainly looking for more. We have time for a couple more questions if anyone has additional questions. I do have one more from, and again, I'm not sure if this will be up your alley, but I'm wondering about the snow cover these last few years. Is that, you know, the snow lasting longer and being deeper in the Whitehorse area, is that a problem for birds?
Well, people who study winter ecology want as much snow as possible, and they want it early in the year. The problem with no snow cover is, of course, that creatures like mice and these other small things, that spiders and all of these things that are out there in the wintertime, can't thermoregulate, and they need what's called a subnivean space. So there's a space at the bottom of the snow where basically it stays near zero, in fact. So that's where mice are in the wintertime. If there's no snow, they really, really suffer. The heavy snowpack, I don't know. It doesn't. Ptarmigan, all of the grouse snow roost. And we have two other species that snow roost, and they need at least 20 centimeters of snow to have a good solid winter. Most of those birds, like, it's one of the things that we learned very early about ptarmigan. We came into the work looking at the winter ecology of ptarmigan, thinking, oh, this must be a tough year, that tough time of year. This must be when most of them die. And we were really shocked when we began to actually look at the birds and measure them. They gain weight all winter. Winter is a wonderful time if you're a ptarmigan, and probably some of the other birds as well that winter here. Migratory birds are up against great mortality because a lot of the habitats that they have to use during migration are being destroyed by people all the way down. That's the problem with migration. Your small migratory birds, half your friends die every year. That's the fact of life.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Just looking for any raised hands or anyone to put a question in the chat. I wanted to let Dave know that I think I first met or saw him when he spoke to my elementary school class when I was about 8 years old and taught us some bird calls. So it's just really great to see your ongoing efforts in reaching young people. And I think I can still attempt a ptarmigan call. Question from Allison. Can you imagine creating more wetlands here?
Well, no, I don't think it's, we don't need to. We have lots and lots of wetlands. Like I said, the permafrost maintains wetlands. Protecting the ones we have is the big issue. It's interesting that if we are going to start protecting habitats in the Yukon, we should start with wetlands. And I don't care what kind of wetlands. There's this idea that we've got all kinds of different kinds of wetlands, and the only wetlands that we should protect are the ones that duck hunters like, or something like that. All wetlands are very, very valuable. A bog willow or bog plant is just as valuable to me as a duck is. These are extremely valuable wet habitats, and protecting them should be our huge priority.
Thank you for that. All right, we probably have time for one or two more questions, so I'll just watch for any raised hands or someone typing in the chat.
Okay, I'll just say that it's really difficult to talk to people that you can't see their voices, their faces. I don't do that kind of a thing very much. All I see is a bunch of little letters all down the side of the. I'm not much of a computer freak, so sorry.
No, it's been amazing, and I really appreciate you joining us in this not totally comfortable environment, because I know it's not ideal for everyone. There's a comment from Scott, just a thanks for your dedication and your long-term work with students. Another comment from Jim Hawkins, great job that you've adapted to the geek age very well. Another question from Allison. Is there going to be a biodiversity day?
We've had such a problem getting meetings together because of your rotten virus. I would really vote strongly for a biodiversity forum again this year, but I'm leaving it up to other people now.
All right, and this will probably be the last question. This is from Darcy. She's curious to know more about all of the unusual bird species that are being seen. For example, hawthorn finch and the whooper crane.
Seeing what? I'm sorry? I didn't hear that.
Some of the more unusual bird species that you're starting to see, such as the hawthorn finch or the whooper crane.
Yeah.
Whooper swan.
Whooper swan, yeah. Well, it's birds are so mobile. Birds are the most mobile creatures on the planet, and it doesn't surprise someone who studies birds all their life to see some of these creatures showing up where they're not supposed to be. One of the amazing things is that birds do stay more in the places that they, birds are famous for selecting habitats and basically knowing where they're supposed to be. The little Steller's jays that came in from the coast over here, it's almost as if those birds know, they're only 2 or 3 hours from here, and yet they've stayed on the coast all these years. Now, as the climate emergency is upon us, and some of the other things that human beings are doing, we might expect some disruption of birds' ranges, but it doesn't surprise. A bird like a large swan can basically cover the planet. So one showing up here is not surprising, but it is unusual. Whether we're responsible for that or not is going to be the moot point.
Great, thank you so much. That takes us pretty much to the hour. So I just really want to say again how much I appreciate you taking the time to speak with our audience today, Dave. And thanks to everyone who's joined and for all your questions. It's been a great talk, a great way to end this YukonU series. And I hope to see you folks again in the fall, and who knows what scope will bring for our audience. But thanks so much, Dave. I hope the rest of your day goes well.
Thank you.